All right, I'm going to kick it off for us. Welcome, everyone, to our May WAPOR webinar. I'm very excited today to have Professor Rory Fitzgerald with us today. Um, and he is the director of the European Social Survey. We're all very aware of the ESS. It was established in 2013 by the European Research Infrastructure Consortium and now being hosted by Professor Fitzgerald at the City St. George's University of London. And the consortium now has about 30 members, over 230,000 registered users. And I'm sure many of us here have not only interacted with the data, used the data, but have grown up with it perhaps in their academic career. So, I know I have. So, I'm really excited for this talk, especially because there's so much happening and changing in the world. And, ESS is really uh, something that we look to for many of us when we do our work. So it's such an honor to have Professor Fitzgerald here with us to talk about how this staple in our academic work is continuing and how it's changing. So thank you so much for joining us, Professor, and I'm going to turn the mic over to you.
Thank you very much for the lovely introduction, and thanks everyone for joining us today. It's really lovely to be with people from WAPOR, World Association of Public Opinion Research, an organisation I've been a member of for many years, and it is very close to my heart. So it's great to be with you all. And of course, everyone here shares an interest in public opinion and, of course, comparative public opinion, comparing countries from across the world. So it's great to be here, and it's lovely to be talking about a comparative survey in Europe. So I'm just going to share my slides, and then I'll just ask the moderators to check that you can see them.
We see it being shared, and we see presenter mode right now.
You can see presenter mode. So
Yeah.
just let me try that again. Is that better?
Yes, perfect.
Yeah, fantastic. So thank you very much. I'm Rory Fitzgerald. I'm Professor of Practice and Survey Research at City University of London, and I'm Director of the European Social Survey. And the European Social Survey was first established in 2002. It became a European research infrastructure in 2013. It was set up to be a comparative survey that was based on the principles of input harmonization to ensure maximum comparability between the countries, and with the aim to measure attitudes, values, and the social conditions of Europeans between countries and over time. We currently have 30 countries taking part in the European Social Survey as members of our organisation, plus the Ukraine, who are also taking part as a guest country. The focus of my talk today is on a significant change to the ESS. The ESS is at a crossroads, with probably the most significant change since its inception now underway, our data collection mode switch. It's perhaps a rare or even unique example of an input harmonised cross-national general social survey changing its data collection mode across a large group of countries in a controlled and planned way where all countries switch in the same way at the same time. Whilst also we're aiming to maintain the SS time series as far as possible, as that's one of our most precious assets. So in my talk today, I'm going to give a little bit of background to the European Social Survey, then some information about the mode switch and why we're changing. Talk about the mixed mode, round 12, which is currently underway. Describe the ESS self-completion approach, gives some initial response rates from countries that have already completed our 12th round. Talk about the sample composition, some of the emerging data there. Briefly look at some data we have also on mode effects and talk about the outlook for the future. So in terms of the background to the mode switch, so when the European Social Survey founders met together to decide on the methodology back in the 1990s, they wanted, as far as possible, to follow an input harmonized approach to comparability. So things should either be the same where that was possible and optimal, or at least equivalent where that wasn't possible, or where that was a more optimal route to the methodology. And in particular, when it came to the data collection mode, they were concerned, the initial founders were concerned not to have different modes in different countries, because they were fully aware that the mode in which people answer the survey questionnaire can impact the results. So by keeping the mode the same, it would be at least reducing one of the barriers to comparability. Looking all the way back then, when they were looking at the modes that they might include in the survey, at that time they were talking about either face-to-face or telephone. Telephone was perhaps one of the alternatives being discussed then. Now, of course, when we're looking at our mode switch, we're talking about online and web surveys, but also, interestingly, paper is having a revival as part of our mode switch. So for most of the first 20 years of ESS, it reaffirms that it would use face-to-face. We had a program of research looking at the possibility of changing mode over time, and every time we discussed that with our methods and scientific advisory boards, we came back to the conclusion for a long time that face-to-face remained the single mode that could be used across all the countries most effectively, and that therefore we should stick with face-to-face to have comparability. Then we had the COVID pandemic, and a self-completion approach was unexpectedly implemented in 9 countries in round 10, following some initial piloting. And I'll talk a bit more about that in the presentation. Following that experiment, kind of forced almost on the infrastructure by the pandemic, a recommendation by an ESS Commission strategic review group, and following on from the successful implementation of self-completion in round 10, recommended that we should transition all data collection to self-completion, and that position was then adopted by the core scientific team of the European Social Survey. As part of that transition, moving from face-to-face to our mixed mode self-completion of web and paper, we are currently conducting our 12th round, where we're comparing face-to-face data collection. So half of all the interviews in the countries will be face-to-face, and half will be self-completion with random assignment to either face-to-face or self-completion within those countries. And then from our 13th round, which will take place in 2027, the fieldwork, we will only be using self-completion for the actual data collection in the ESS. So a significant period of transition. So cast your minds back to the time of the pandemic. Our face-to-face data collection was under serious challenges because of the restrictions caused by the pandemic. So we started to experiment and really focus on the possibility to move ESS to self-completion mode. So the first thing we did is we did a 3-country push to web experiment in Austria, Hungary, and Serbia. We wanted to test the feasibility of a postal first self-completion approach, and we decided early on to use web and paper, concerned that there's a significant number of offliners in many of the countries in Europe still, and also to try to provide a comparable but optimal route to enable people to take part, so not only forcing them to use a single mode. And we were also concerned about maybe transitioning the whole of the ESS survey from the face-to-face to self-completion. So the ESS face-to-face took around 1 hour to complete, um, at least when administered in British English. And we were concerned based upon that kind of sense that we all have in our field that self-completion surveys could not and should not really be as long, maybe as interviewer administered ones. So we took only a third of the ESS questionnaire and we tested that in these 3 countries using a postal first push to web design. And we achieved response rates of between 33 and 39%. In most of these countries, it had been a significant period of time since there had been self-completion surveys and perhaps never even push to web surveys. So we weren't really sure what to expect in terms of response rates, but we'd hoped for around 20%. So we were pleasantly surprised by these higher rates that we got. And when we looked at the sample composition, we found that it was very similar in these 3 countries to the face-to-face. So we concluded that there was promise to perhaps move ESS to self-completion, and we continued along the path. Now, I mentioned that we were concerned about the length of the survey. So we tested a 50-minute version of the survey to a 35-minute version of the survey in Austria, repeating the postal first push to web approach. We already knew what we could get in Austria from a 20-minute survey. So we kind of had a benchmark and we wanted to compare this longer version to the shorter one. And the response rate did differ a little. It was a little lower, and it was a statistically significant difference between the 50 and the 35-minute one, but it was a relatively small difference in terms of the kind of effect size. So we were, again, reassured that there was the potential to still try to administer a longer questionnaire, because particularly in a cross-national environment, the idea of splitting the questionnaire up into much smaller parts and running it in smaller chunks over time and so forth, or having complicated matrix designs, all really was too complicated within a cross-national survey aiming to deliver relatively regularly. So we were kind of slightly reassured about the possibility of continuing with a longer questionnaire. So that's what happened a little bit in the early stages of the pandemic. Just for a minute, stepping back to thinking about why the ESS is changing to self-completion in a more general sense. The other issues we face is that face-to-face interviewing in Europe has become more difficult to implement in recent years. Costs have been increasing and funders are often becoming reluctant to pay some of these higher costs. There have been falling response rates to many face-to-face surveys, particularly in the last 2 to 3 rounds of the ESS. There's also been less fieldwork agencies willing and able to bid to do the ESS survey, and fewer experienced interviewers appear to be available with higher turnover. We also know from the past that there's been clear evidence of interviewer effects. A lot of work was done on that in the past in the ESS. And we know that could also then be exacerbated if there are fewer interviewers working on more cases. So there was a concern about interviewer effects and the fact that they differ also between countries. We know that particularly since the pandemic, agencies have been struggling to retain and recruit face-to-face interviewers in some, but not all countries. And that's also been a concern. And we felt that face-to-face, we were getting to a point where it was unlikely to remain a viable mode to use in all countries, particularly maybe in countries like Czechia and Sweden. There was a recent round of the ESS where no agency in Czechia actually bid to do the ESS face-to-face. We kept thinking that moment might come, and then it actually did in Czechia. So it was becoming an increasingly unreliable mode to rely on to use in all countries. This chart here shows the face-to-face response rates that we've achieved on the ESS from 2004 to 2024. It includes all countries that took part in all of the rounds between 2 and 11, but excludes any self-completion response rates in round 10 for the countries that did switch during the pandemic. And the average ESS response rate has fallen from just over 60% to just under 40% over 20 years, with particular steep declines since 2014. And in ESS round 10, the lowest ever response rate of 22% was achieved in the UK. So a self-completion future was also becoming more viable, even in a cross-national context, as the face-to-face was experienced more difficulties. As you'll all be aware, of course, there's been rising internet penetration to support the use of the web. Other surveys, like the European Values Survey, Gender Generation Survey, had shown good response rate could be achieved in self-completion mode in Europe. So there were positive signs from other surveys that were experimenting and trialing in this space. Face-to-face, with worsening data quality in face-to-face, self-completion also has some advantages. Reduction in social desirability bias, no interviewer effects, possibility of more consistency across countries. It's easier to harmonize data collection instruments and so forth in the self-completion mode. But there are some concerns, particularly around accessibility, maybe for some groups, and data quality issues also remain of a concern and is an area that we need to work on going forward. There are also some concerns about the low literacy group and also with the future of postal services. So we have seen in one country, they're not currently in the ESS, in Denmark, the end of the state-funded postal service. So this is obviously something for the future that we need to be aware of and keep on top of. Also, we could have allowed different approaches between countries as we were starting to think of a mode switch, but we opted to go for a uniform switch, given the mission of the ESS to provide cross-national comparability with input harmonization. And we also didn't want the mode switch to go on forever and ever for a decade or so. So we took the plunge and decided we would ask all countries to switch at the same time. So we're currently in the middle of our 12th round. Fieldwork is underway or completed in some countries, just getting underway in others. And we are conducting a mixed mode round. We wanted to have a controlled transition where we were able to be really clear with our data users what the impact of the mode switch was. So sample units have been randomly assigned either to face-to-face or self-completion data collection as part of official round 12 fieldwork. And we've managed to do this in most, but not all countries. There are a small number of countries that have had to stick only to self-completion to move straight away, or have maybe a slightly smaller self-completion part. But the vast majority of countries, we have this random assignment to these two different conditions. This reflects the strategic review recommendation, which to make a gradual transition with embedded experiments. We hope that the mixed mode round will help to ease the effect of the mode change on the ESS time series rather than injecting this in a single round. So this is kind of almost like the bridging round. And we will be providing advice and guidance to users alongside the data release. There'll be an imputed version of the ESS round 12 dataset for users in the future. Fieldwork started in September of last year. Early results, self-completion are promising, and I'll show some of those in a moment. It has been a lot of work for everyone involved in the ESS, and particularly for our national teams who've had to coordinate these two different data collection methods, one of which in many cases was newer for them. So many thanks to all of them in particular for their hard work. So a little bit more information now about the ESS self-completion approach itself. Countries can choose whether to use a postal first approach to make contact with selected sample units to ask them to take part in the survey, or whether they will use a field worker first design, where the field workers will visit the addresses and introduce the survey and then ask people to conduct the interview themselves without the field worker present in cases where it's maybe difficult to use the postal system. Postal first approach, web and paper questionnaires are offered to respondents across 4 mailings and contacts, an invitation letter and 3 reminders. The paper questionnaire is either given at the beginning in a concurrent design or later in a sequential design. And again, it's up to the national coordinator to choose whether they will use concurrent or sequential design and whether they will use a postal first or a field worker first design. Just to stress that the field worker's role, at least in the 12th round, has been very much only to deliver the materials and encourage participation, never to conduct interviews, and neither to conduct within household selection, which is left to the households in all cases where that's needed. Unconditional monetary incentives are required for the postal first design and strongly recommended for the field worker. First design and conditional incentives are also strongly recommended for both approaches. A limited field worker follow-up phase, not to nudge on non-responding sample units, is required for countries that use the postal system but cannot target non-responders in another way. So we'll come on to why this is needed later, but particularly to try to tackle underrepresentation of the lowest education groups. Sometimes these field worker visits remain an important element. So we had a long 20 years or more of data collection in the ESS in face-to-face mode. We then had to try to transpose the questionnaire into self-completion instruments. So we weren't starting from scratch, and that was obviously a big constraint. But luckily it turned out that the ESS questionnaire could be transitioned into self-completion instruments. And that's, of course, by no means possible for all surveys, those that require a lot of routing or feed forward information or have lots of loops and so forth. That certainly wouldn't be possible to transition that into a paper questionnaire, but it was possible for the ESS. So at least for the moment in the ESS self-completion instruments, they're as similar as possible to the face-to-face. The main stimulus in all the questions remains the same in terms of the core thing that respondents are being asked about. And there were, of course, minor changes like taking out references to show cards. There was a particular challenge with the scale orientation. So those of you familiar with the ESS questionnaire will know we have a lot of 11-point scales. And they are horizontal. They were shown on show cards in the past. Whilst it's possible, of course, to keep them horizontal in the paper self-completion questionnaires, that's not possible on the web, particularly on smartphones, which many of the respondents are using to answer the survey, and therefore there is a difference here between modes, whereas on the web they appear vertically, whereas on the paper self-completion questionnaire they're horizontal. We have the challenge of what to do with the missing items, and I know there are many people that feel passionately about this topic. We went for the approach in the end of telling respondents they could leave any question blank, but there are no prompted don't knows or refusals as in the face-to-face. So I know some surveys, self-completion mode, include them on each question. We haven't done that. There are others that don't know and refuse pop up if you tried to leave it blank. We haven't done that either. We've just told respondents they can leave any question they don't want to answer blank. There are a few exceptions where for sort of ethical reasons we have added a prefer not to answer code, but in most cases this is up to the respondent just to leave it blank. We've done a lot of work to slightly shorten the education lists and we've done that, and we're not expecting non-response to increase much around the education measurement. We've had more difficulties with our occupation part of the questionnaire, and that will be revamped for round 13 to make it more suitable for self-completion use. But we are expecting slightly higher missing items for being able to code to ISCO 08 with the current version. So maybe in face-to-face, it'd be about 1% of occupations that we couldn't code, whereas now it'd be closer to 12. But we hope that that will reduce in the future with our revamped round 13 approach. We also faced another challenge that those of you familiar with our questionnaire will know at the end, we have something called the human value scale, which was produced by Shalom Schwartz. That was gender specific. So men were asked to think of someone who might be like them, and they referred to he throughout, and women vice versa. But we've created a gender neutral version of that human value scale. We didn't want the paper questionnaire to be too long in terms of the number of pages and so forth, and we wanted to reduce routing. So we have revamped that part of our questionnaire as well. So in terms of the self-completion tools and materials, we were really lucky to work with the late Don Dillman towards the end of his career. And he was a fantastic advisor and a great colleague to work with. We were there in the middle of the pandemic, and Don would be there at 5 in the morning, helping us out with great passion. And so we were very lucky to have his input. So massive thanks to him, everything that he did for the ESS mode transition. So many of these elements in terms of the communication side and other elements of our design were inspired by some of his work. So invitation letters and reminders, the university and institutional logos appear on them. The letter always refers to the first questionnaire topics. A link between the questionnaire and the letter is therefore established. We have the first topics in the survey that are most likely to appeal. We actually changed the beginning of the questionnaire to a new topic just to help guide respondents in. We have a reference to living in Britain or living in France throughout the questionnaire, and on the paper questionnaires there's a map of Europe with the specific country that you're in highlighted. Where possible, we've used cash in the envelopes, but in any case we always try to have monetary incentives wherever possible, and we recommend varying the envelopes per mailing too. Rendering the letters into the different national contexts has proved a challenge, and just simply kind of translating the centrally designed letter hasn't proved to be completely possible in many cases, or perhaps optimal in many cases. So there's been some flexibility, some discussions between the central and national teams on this, and I think there'll be more national adaptation going forward, particularly where there's been any difficulties with the response rates and so forth. We've also developed for the data collection itself an ESS self-completion platform. So all the respondents in Europe will answer the web survey via the same server and the same web platform provided by our colleagues at Centre Data in the Netherlands. That platform also includes all of the translations for all of the countries, where the TRAPD translation process is recorded, and then the final translations agreed feed directly into the web questionnaire, and actually they also then allow automatic generation of the paper questionnaires as well. So this really is a kind of big centralization of that process and has led to a more harmonized approach there. This really means it's also more possible to ensure that respondents across all the countries see things in a very similar way. Paper questionnaire itself, this is our example from our 10th round where we used during the pandemic. Again, it was Don Dillman's suggestion to attempt to use a 2-column design, which in the end proved more than successful. And you can see here the horizontal 11-point scales, and just going back to my previous screen, you can see on the web survey that those would appear vertically. Okay, so that's a little bit of background to why we're making the change, what the change consists of in terms of how we're approaching that, and a little bit of the earlier background, the early piloting that we've done. So we're now in our 12th round, and I'm going to give some of the initial response rates and compare those between face-to-face and self-completion. And I'm just going to start, I'm only going to present today the countries basically who have finished on this first slide. So about half of countries in the ESS 15 have concluded the data collection in both modes. And here we can compare the response rates. And in 11 of those 15, self-completion has a higher response rate than face-to-face. But in some of the Central and East European countries, the response rate is a little bit lower in self-completion, or sometimes substantially lower, for example, in Slovakia. ESS set a target response rate of 45% for self-completion, and in many countries have exceeded this. The country with the highest response rate in this round is Slovenia. I should stress that these response rates are provisional, and we haven't yet corrected for ineligibility. So in most cases, the final APOR response rates will be somewhat higher than the ones quoted here. Of all the countries that have actually started, not all of these are shown here, but thinking of across the country, the fieldwork's underway. It looks like so far that there'll be one country maybe that will have a response rate under 20%, but in all of the other 29 countries, we're expecting response rates of at least 20% or higher. So at least in terms of cooperation with the survey, engagement with the survey from amongst those we're asking to take part, the early signs are promising, but we will only have a full picture, of course, once all the data collection is completed by the end of this year, and we're able to present the final results next year. I just wanted to show one other thing as well about the design. So we're often asked why we've included paper. Is paper really important? What's the future of paper in the survey? So breaking this down a little bit more, I've included two additional countries here who've almost finished, which is the Netherlands and Ireland, who've completed self-completion, but not face-to-face. So I didn't include them on the last chart, but I'm including them here. And here you can see that even in the country with the lowest use of paper, in the Netherlands, 1 in 10 respondents still answered in that mode. In Bulgaria, on the other hand, only 1 in 10 respondents are actually answering on the web. This chart shows here whether or not countries are using a sequential or a concurrent design, but even in the sequential design, we can see the appeal of a paper questionnaire. One point I should note is where in the sequential countries, the invitation letters do inform respondents or potential respondents that a paper questionnaire will be available later in the process. So that's an important point to note. Yeah, really, we can see a significant amount of paper use. One interesting example is in Ireland. And in Ireland, where there is a substantial use of paper, we find that in all demographic educational groups, for example, even the most highest educated, the majority are still choosing paper in that concurrent design. So where respondents are offered a choice, quite often they do like paper, obviously more than survey methodologists and data collectors, because we'd rather people did everything online if possible. But for the moment, it's important, I think, to keep paper as a key part of our design. A few weeks ago, we had a national coordinator forum in Athens, and our national coordinators came together, and some of them were able to share some very initial examples in terms of sample composition. I do want to stress these are very preliminary. They're not for quoting or documenting in that sense, but they do give an initial flavour, I think, of some of the successes, but also the challenges of the self-completion approach, and for survey research in general. Going forward, the core scientific team of the ESS has set a kind of guidance for when bias is seen as particularly problematic and requires kind of efforts to try to resolve it in the future. And that's particularly when the relative bias versus the population for a subgroup is greater than 25% after design weighting. These results that I'm showing you now have not been corrected for design weighting because they're not available yet. So again, that's another word of caution. But we can see here that in terms of the relative bias, in terms of gender, that there aren't particular problems. In fact, in none of the countries has that threshold of 25% been breached. And overall, balance between men and women in the self-completion is not a cause for concern. Now we turn to age, and here we can just see two age groups again as an example, the 15 to 34-year-olds and the 65 plus. We can see that older respondents are sometimes being overrepresented in a substantial number of countries, and there's a smaller number of countries also where perhaps the youngest group are a little bit underrepresented as well. This is perhaps the most significant challenge for the future of our self-completion approach. It'd be very interesting when we can compare these results to those from the face-to-face. But here we can see that the self-completion approach is underrepresenting those with the lowest levels of education. It scales 0 to 2. And tackling non-response amongst the lowest educated is probably the biggest priority for the ESS, I think, in the years to come. When we get the full data from all of the countries next year, we'll really be able to see how this compares with the face-to-face data collection conducted in parallel, and also how it compares with other surveys in the field. And you can see there's a similar difficulty here with those who are not born in the country or who don't have citizenship. Again, the relative bias being breached here. Self-completion approach perhaps offers the possibility to address this by providing questionnaires in more languages. In a way, that's the easy part. The more difficult part is communicating with people in this group in a way that encourages them to take part in the survey in the first place. But again, an interesting challenge for the ESS and other surveys. In the final part of my presentation, I'd like to discuss a little bit about mode effects. So I'm going to take you back now to the pandemic time when some of the countries switched from face-to-face to self-completion and others remained in face-to-face. So whilst that's not a full experiment, it does allow some initial conclusions to be drawn about the possibility of mode effects. So we commissioned a special advisor, Peter Lugtig, who's now since become a part of the core scientific team of the ESS, to compare ESS round 9 and ESS round 10 for countries that did and did not switch mode. And he focused on standardized mean differences and standardized differences in variance and covariances in the ESS core questionnaire. So he's just looking at the core questionnaire, not our rotating modules. This overall finding is that there were small but notable differences between the two modes for about 20% of the variables in the core questionnaire. Often these were driven by a higher frequency of the use of the endpoints in self-completion surveys. He found little or no effect for variances and covariances, and the country-specific mode effects were also observed, so it's not necessarily a uniform pattern. He also produced this graph. So on the y-axis here, the vertical one, you can see the differences between round 9 face-to-face and round 10 self-completion, the time and mode effect. And on the x-axis, you can see the differences between round 9 and round 10 face-to-face, the time effect. So there is, as expected, and as we've seen across the data collection of the ESS, quite a lot of stability in variables, with most variables changing only very slightly, if at all, due to the time between rounds. So despite the pandemic, therefore you can see the bunching in the far left. However, the countries where the mode did change, as well, of course, as the time, we see evidence of change beyond time, which is likely to be a mode effect, either from sample changes, measurement differences, or both. And we will, of course, know more about that with our round 12 data collection soon. And finally, in terms of the mode effects, the second part I want to show you is an example from round 10 of the ESS. So in round 10 of the ESS, there were two countries, Finland and Great Britain, where we were able to run a self-completion parallel run to the face-to-face data collection. So a little bit like a trial run of what we're seeing across our infrastructure in the 12th round. And one of the modules in ESS round 10 was a module on Europeans' understanding and evaluations of democracy. And it was based on a theoretical model, and we were comparing respondents' evaluations of democracy, how democracy is working in their country, to how they think democracy should work. So in theory, how they thought democracy should work. It was a repeat module. And as I mentioned, these two countries, Great Britain and Finland, had this web data collection alongside the face-to-face. And you can see the sample sizes in the table to the right. So these are the questions. There are questions asking respondents in the ESS to tell the interviewer or to answer in self-completion how important things are for democracy in general. This shows the face-to-face way of asking the questions, but there was a comparable one in self-completion. And then they were also asked to evaluate how these different elements of democracy are working in their country. We had a number of hypotheses because it was a topic of democracy. We didn't expect a high interviewer effect. We didn't think it would be particularly controversial, this kind of theoretical discussion of the different elements of democracy. We didn't expect a lot of social desirability, so we didn't expect many differences perhaps between the modes. We expected the sample composition to perhaps be similar. These were both countries with a tradition of doing high quality self-completion data collection already. And therefore, we didn't really expect many differences in the data that these would be observed. However, we had a number of findings. First of all, the sample composition between Great Britain and Finland was pretty similar, except for education. But what we did find was that there was, in our means difference analysis, that many items did actually show a difference in the means between the two modes, and the higher means scores were found in face-to-face than self-completion in both countries. So this table here shows the weighted means for the views on democracy items. The figures in red are statistically significant, and we see higher mean scores here for face-to-face than self-completion in both countries. For example, on minority rights in Great Britain, it's a mean of 7.8 in self-completion and 8.5 in face-to-face. The mean score differences between self-completion and face-to-face across all items were 0.42 in Great Britain and 0.24 in Finland. And a similar pattern on the evaluation items. Again, mean score difference across all the items was 0.39 Great Britain between self-completion and face-to-face and 0.42 in Finland. So we did find some differences in the means by mode between the face-to-face and the self-completion approach. Taking the examples of the views questions, we used composite scores to look at the relationships proposed by the theoretical model in the subdimensions. And we looked at the average scores for each of the democracy concepts using the indicator items. This table shows the direction and strength of the relationships between the composite scores of the different democracy concepts for the views items. And you can see that in Great Britain, the correlations are either the same in both modes, all except one, in Great Britain, or the differences are quite minimal between liberal and direct democracy, for example. In Finland, some of the face-to-face correlations are weaker than the self-completion ones, and in 2 cases, no correlations were found in the face-to-face, but they were in the self-completion. But there were no situations in which the correlational differences are very large between the modes, and the mode difference in each country context are relatively small or even non-existent. So our conclusion from this parallel run experiment was that the self-completion data here was showing significantly lower scores than the face-to-face on many items, but the conceptual model was functionally similarly between the modes, and the conceptual model is something which is key for many of our data users. So in terms of reflections and outlook, I think for the European Social Survey, we had to change mode. It was the time to do it. Is there ever a right time? Probably not, but this, I think, was the best time, all things considered. Face-to-face was clearly not going to be viable for ESS going forward. I mean, we are an organisation that would want to contract field work once every 2 years. We don't have our own field force. We are reliant on the market. That is where social science is. We don't have our own data collection tools in social sciences. In general, we have to rely for our survey data collection on the market, on fieldwork agencies. That's not how data collection is conducted in other scientific domains, but it is how it's ended up being done in social science domain. And therefore, if the market is unable to provide face-to-face data collection for ESS in some countries, something had to be done. We are very fortunate our questionnaire works in self-completion mode. This isn't a viable transition to web and paper for all surveys. The response rates are promising. They're better than we'd expected. And I do believe they can be improved more in the future. We've already seen some changes between kind of response rates we got during the pandemic mode and now, and I think with some further changes, that can be improved even more. Sample representativeness is good for gender, reasonable for age. We do need to do more, particularly around those with lower education. Fascinating indeed it will be to compare this to that for the face-to-face surveys. Little or no mode effect is expected for variances and covariances, but some point estimates will be impacted, and we will need to help our data users and other users of the findings of the ESS to understand what that means. There are some country-specific mode effects. I haven't really had time to go into those today, but this will be something we'll be drawing out more as we release the data, because there are specific countries, specific variables, particularly those affected by social desirability, that we need to watch. Self-completion does come with some negatives, so we are moving from being a single mode data collection survey to a mixed mode one. Paper and web self-completion are pretty similar in terms of the way the stimulus is seen by respondents, but of course not identical. Respondents on paper, of course, can peruse the whole questionnaire. They can flip backwards and forward more easily, make more mistakes and so forth. So it's not without difficulties, but on balance, paper, I think, is needed. There are many benefits to moving away from face-to-face, particularly losing these interviewer effects and reducing the social desirability. We've aimed to reduce the impact on the ESS time series. That's a choice, but it comes at a cost. I mean, we could have instead chosen to rewrite the ESS questionnaire for self-completion mode, and maybe at some point in the future, that will be something that the ESS will decide to look at more closely, but that's for later discussion. Mixed mode round 12, I think, will serve the data users. It will be available to all of you, along with a lot of para data from the web data collection. So I hope that many of you will be able to make use of that. Like everything with ESS, we make everything freely available. And I do just want to add my final comment that this transition is not to the web, it's to self-completion. And at least for the foreseeable future, that involves paper as well as web data collection. Lastly, of course, ESS is team science. I'm presenting to you today, but it's a big collaborative project. Here's a picture of our national coordinators and members of our core scientific team from our recent meeting in Athens. But I'd also like to thank our scientific and methods advisory boards as well, and the ESS mode switch team at the HQ. And I will leave it there, but of course, very happy to take any questions.
Thank you so much. We have a number of questions in the chat. Um, and please feel free, those that want to unmute and pose your question as well. You're welcome to do that. The first question comes from Mongolia, um, and they are wondering about the techniques to motivate respondents for completion, um, highlighting their own experience. They're faced with situation that owners lend their apartments. It's very specific. I wonder if you have thoughts on that, and feel free to answer any others in the chat too.
So what was that last point about the owners?
As they said, the text is lists wonder about techniques to motivate respondents to participate in survey. Listen about these sending invitation letters, but faced with situation that owners lend their apartments. So perhaps
Well,
people
just
that,
in terms of motivation in general, I think it's obviously the communications are very important. It's obviously crucial also to use the unconditional incentives and for those to be something which is easily accessible and appealing. I mean, we've seen some really big changes in some of the feasibility testing. Things have gone badly, and national teams have made a very small change to the incentive, like not presenting it in an envelope, for example, just having it within the letter, but not hidden within an envelope. Big change, very positive change in terms of motivation of people taking part. Um, Another one would be just trying to think of another example in terms of the incentives. Yeah, in Croatia, they moved to a system where the postal service there is able to deliver the incentives at the doorstep. It's maybe something specific to Croatia, but again, that made a big difference to their response rate. So the cannot emphasize enough the importance of these unconditional incentives. I know there's some challenges around them, and funders don't always like them, and ethical questions sometimes arise and so forth, but they really are one of the key drivers to that motivation. In terms of availability of people in apartments, I guess I'm not really sure of the situation in Mongolia, but I mean, if people aren't present at the address, I guess if you're using a named person sample, that would be a big problem. Might there be ways to kind of trace respondents and things like that? But I'd need to know a bit more about the specific examples there. We haven't really found that to be a big problem in Europe, that people are not living at the address where they're registered, or therefore the people that are living there would then be the ones eligible for the survey. So that's not been too much of a problem.
we only have 5 minutes left, and there are definitely a number of countries. I'm going to summarize some of the key questions.
Yeah.
Some questions from Anna about cost, the impact of switching to self-completion mode, and I think let's see if I can find.
But I mean, overall, this has led to a cost reduction. We're waiting for the final figures now. But it would be a sort of, I think, about a 10% reduction in the fieldwork costs overall across the infrastructure. It's a bit of an uneven pattern. Some countries have benefited a lot more, particularly those with high labour costs. Those with lower labour costs have sometimes found that this has led to an increase in the cost. So it's an uneven pattern between countries, but overall, this has saved the money, ESS money on the data collection.
There are a couple questions about the length of time, or how do you assess, how does the team assess the length of time used to complete the survey, whether you would know how much time people are using? And then there's a follow-up to that um, from Gabriella about how do you know the real respondent is completing the survey?
So two really good questions. So first of all, we do have the interview duration, including length of time per question. That Paradata will also be available to all of you when we release the data. So we have the data collection time. So we know that the mode is around 50 minutes. The mean is about 52 minutes for doing the survey. There are, of course, some outliers, but we haven't found any very, very few where it's kind of a completely impractical length of time, for example, 5 minutes or something like that. But obviously we do monitor that, and any cases like that are removed, and that's documented. Um, in terms of the real respondent, um, we don't actually completely know this. We need to be frank about this. So, in countries where we have access to the register, we send a letter to the named person from the register. That letter would go to them. They're asked to do the survey. In other countries, we ask the person with the next birthday to do the survey. There's a check at the beginning of the questionnaire. It's stated in the letter. But we cannot absolutely know that for certain that it really is the person with the next birthday. We have produced a paper, and I'd be happy to send the link to you for circulation afterwards about uh, looking at whether we think it is the person with the next birthday that's done the survey. So I'm happy to share a link to that afterwards.
Thank you so much. All right. In the last 2 minutes that we have together, um, I think in general, there are some just queries about the transition and particular issues that you are definitely trying to get ahead of, um, and things that you anticipate may go wrong. Um, and I think there's a specific question about paradata. So, will the paradata be available on all countries, including the mixed mode round 12 cross-national experiment? And would you be able to connect the paradata to contact forms and survey data?
It will be available. Yes.
Wonderful.
I mean, it will require lots of processing, but we're not going to like pre-process a lot of that data, but we
Mm-hmm.
certainly will be making that available,
Mm-hmm.
probably within about 4 months of the main data being released. So that will be there. Yeah.
I guess in the last minute, what are you most excited about? I know right before the call, the webinar, you were saying that in a year from now, it will be most exciting to really understand the data that's collected. Kind of looking ahead, do you foresee and are you anticipating any obstacles or challenges to finish up the rest of the countries and
I, I'm really excited to see all the work that the community is going to do with this data, because I don't think there's many examples where you have so much mixed mode data in a controlled experimental like way like this across country. So we're hoping, future ESRA conferences, WAPOR, that there'll be many papers of people from the community looking at this data, looking at the paradata. So I'm really excited about that. In terms of the future, I think the thing that worries me most is probably this current reliance on the postal mail to deliver the request to take part in the survey. Um, if more and more countries were to lose their postal mail delivery system, then we would have to think other ways to get that request to respondents. There might be digital mailboxes in the future, but
Mm,
how could you possibly make your
yeah.
request then stand out from all the others? So if there's one thing that maybe keeps me up at night about the future, it's probably that at the moment.
Wow. Yeah, that is true. Ongoing changes in our society. Thank you so much, Professor Fitzgerald, for really sharing insights. So much to learn, and we had a lovely turnout, lots of wonderful questions, really trying to learn from your experiences and your colleagues' experiences and what they should be doing in their own countries. Um, Thank you again. And the recording is available afterwards, and we'll definitely be sharing it to all the folks that had RSVP'd to the webinar. And oh, you're still sharing screen in case you want to unshare. And so thank you everyone for being here. Have a lovely rest of your day, and we will see you again for another WAPOR webinar. Thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you. Goodbye.
Thank you. Goodbye.